There are many obstacles that can block the path to a successful software project. When you come across one, it helps to think like a seasoned hiker and follow the trail marked by blue blazes around the problem so that you can get back on course and keep moving forward. Welcome to Blue Blazes Podcast. I'm your host for the journey, Jay Tower, and I'm a partner and principal consultant at Trailhead Technology Partners. In this series, we talk with industry experts who share their best tips for avoiding the pitfalls on the path to successful software projects. Mike Benkovich is a Microsoft Azure MVP, developer, business owner, and consultant, as well as a former Microsoft employee. He's an expert in Microsoft Azure, which he frequently speaks about at events all around the world. While at Microsoft, he helped create the Azure Bootcamp events that have been run in cities all across the US. He's published Azure courses for LinkedIn Learning, but he now actively works in cloud governance, application architecture, and software delivery consulting. In this episode, Mike and I speak about artificial intelligence and how it can help software teams become more successful. Well, hello, Mike, and welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Jay, how are you doing today?
Doing really well, thanks. Thanks for joining us.
It's good to be here. Being in Minneapolis in the winter of whatever it is that never ends. I think we're on January 78th now. So,
well, there is hope. Summer is coming, right?
Yeah.
So we talk about on this podcast things that help make software projects more reliably successful. And you wanted to talk today about AI, which is a really timely topic. It's certainly in the news a lot right now. People are talking and thinking about this a lot more than they were a year or two ago. Suddenly, again, it's been a hot topic. A lot of the stuff that I've read online has been sort of breathless articles about AIs becoming sentient and taking over the world and all those kinds of things. But what I want to know from you, Mike, as a day in, day out software guy and someone who's looked a lot into this AI stuff is, what are the actual things that you think that somebody who's in software should be looking at AI for right now?
Oh, it's definitely a timely topic, and AI is the latest of the tools that enable us to be more productive as developers, as workers in general, as a knowledge worker. How do we, take advantage of these different things that are out there? I look at AI as another tool for our tool belt. It comes from a long line of, how did we get here, and what are all the different things that are, kind of feeding into the typical developer's, environment now. And yeah, it's a real timely topic, especially with OpenAI and cognitive services and Azure, with a whole lot of different parts of that.
Mm-hmm. So it seems like from your answer there that I maybe can guess what your answer to this would be, but to get this question out of the way, what are your thoughts on is AI going to take over all of our jobs?
What is it they say that now is not the time for fear? That comes later. The reality is it's a tool, and I do woodworking. When I was a kid, I remember my parents took us to Williamsburg, and I remember seeing the cabinet makers and watching them, make a drawer with those dovetails. I thought, oh, that is just so cool. Mm-hmm. And I was trying to, build a thing, and I got out my saw and I tried cutting the dovetails, and by hand, it's actually a fairly hard thing to do. Mm-hmm. And but it's like you can spend a lot of hours, and after a number of years, you can get really good at this. Or you can do what I did, which was go out to Rockler and buy a dovetail jig to plug your router in and just work your way around it, and you get perfect dovetails every time. Mm-hmm. I look at AI, especially some of the stuff that's coming out with ChatGPT, the large language models, and some of the newer things as being sort of like that dovetail jig, but for language and for coding and for understanding. I might want to do dovetails here, but I don't do dovetails everywhere. It's knowing when and where to use the jig. it fits into my tool belt, and it's part of the things I use to, be write better code. So that's kind of where I see AI. It's not going to replace me because I still need to know when do I want to use it.
Something that I've thought recently is that if you're the kind of developer who's afraid of it and kind of holds it at arm's length and doesn't learn it, that
Hmm.
maybe is the only kind of developer that is at risk of losing their job or being less employable or something like that, is somebody who refuses the new tools and says, I want
Right.
to be 100% manual developer. Do you
Well,
think that's correct?
it's sort of like the developer who decides to do everything in VI because, well, that's what they know. And there's
Hmm.
a bunch of keyboard shortcuts they learned when they were, new to developing back in the 80s. Maybe, I don't
Yeah.
know. VI is an incredible editor, but it doesn't have a lot of the new capabilities. I mean, if you think about it, IntelliSense, something we take for granted today. I go out and I start typing in, in my Razor code in my .NET app. I go, at inject, and it gives me like a bunch of auto completion things.
Hmm.
That's sort of a tool. It's sort of an AI thing. It's telling me, it's looking at the library of what my choices might be, and it's making a suggestion. But if I'm in Notepad, I don't have IntelliSense. And when's the
Hmm.
last time you actually wrote code that you trusted in Notepad?
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
you can.
The probability
And
of
then,
typos is high, right?
oh, it is. And so you step back and you say, well, what tools do people use? And, I was a Visual Studio evangelist for a long, long time.
Hmm.
Everything was Visual Studio. In fact, I could hardly do a talk at a conference without opening up Visual Studio and doing half of it in there. And it was almost like my speaking. It's like, some people use PowerPoint, I use Visual Studio. VS Code came along, and VS Code is a different kind of a tool. I mean, when you look at tools that you use, where do you spend your time?
Hmm. Yeah, in IDEs or fancy
Hmm.
editors like VS Code. Hmm.
Well, and is VS Code really a fancy editor, or is it just something that's a sandbox that we can plug things into? That's one of the
Yeah.
things about VS Code that I love is that you've got all these extensions I can
Hmm.
add to it. There's just a lot of great things you can do that allow you to be more productive as a developer.
Yeah, and I think I saw, speaking of Chat GPT and VS Code, I think I saw that I think it's GitHub Copilot's new version is
Hmm.
coming out as a plugin for VS Code.
Yes,
Have you seen that? I think it's
yes,
called
yes.
GitHub Copilot X or something like that.
Hmm. Yep. Uh, the GitHub Copilot is the an extension that came out uh, over the last probably a year or so. There was preview versions that they were putting out there before it got to the public release. But what it does is it allows you to type in part of a line, and it will suggest not only the ending of it, but maybe even in several lines of code. The newer versions of GitHub Copilot include the ability to write a comment like, hey, create a unit test for this. And then it'll suggest a line of code that you can go ahead and plug into it.
Yeah.
Last week or the week before, they are talking about this new version that is Copilot Chat, which sounds like they're doing more than just adding code, but they can explain, what does it do and how does it
Hmm.
work and what are the flaws, and if I were to fix these flaws, what kind of code might I add?
Hmm. I think that's really powerful. I think a lot of people who are still a little nervous about AI and how it fits into their jobs
Hmm.
are nervous about this, this thing that happens already on Stack Overflow, where you ask a
Hmm.
question and then people go find that first answer or the highest voted
Hmm.
answer or whatever and just copy and paste it without even knowing what it's doing. But one of the things
Hmm.
that's so cool about this is that uh, it's not Stack Overflow. It's actually has the ability to explain why
Hmm.
that code and how it works. It's a pretty
Yeah,
powerful feature.
which gives you the opportunity to learn from it.
Hmm.
So you can say, well, I need to add two numbers and come up with the average or the mean, or I've got an array of numbers. Calculate the standard deviation. Well, what is a standard deviation? Now you're going back to your math textbook and trying to look up and see how this thing works. But ChatGPT can offer you that
Hmm.
function, but then also describe what's happening.
Hmm.
And so over the last couple months, I've started digging into ChatGPT just for just a general, question and answer. How can I ask more specific questions? And what I've found is that it's leading me to learning how to ask better questions.
Mm-hmm. Sort of a funny side effect of ChatGPT that I've noticed as I've used it to generate some code recently is what I'll
Hmm.
call the rubber duck effect. I assume you're familiar
Hmm.
with that effect, Mike, but just for the listener, that's when you use an inanimate object like a little rubber duck or something you put next to your monitor and you try and explain a problem to it. And usually in the explaining, it actually rewires your brain. That old saying
Hmm.
that says, if you want to learn something, you should teach it. Um, it's sort of like explaining it to the rubber duck. So what I found is that as I try to figure out how to ask ChatGPT to do what I want or to explain something, that in that I'm actually rewiring my brain a little bit to think about it differently,
Hmm.
to even come up with a
Hmm.
good question.
Yeah. The idea of ChatGPT is that it's predicting what words would follow the previous words based on the context of what words you've used so far.
Mm-hmm.
And when you dive into the actual how is this thing actually working, where did it come from? I mean, it's an interesting space in that it's based on the knowledge that has been trained on. What's the most likely next thing to do?
Mm-hmm.
And it injects not just the most likely all the time, but sometimes it takes the second or the third thing in that list, which injects a little bit of flavor to it.
Mm-hmm.
And what they call that is there's a word for it to describe where you've got your confidence in what this thing is, but it can be very deterministic that you get the same answer every time if you do 100%. But if you back it off to like 85% of the time picking the top choice, then you get something that is a little bit more human feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And and I think that's where the affection for having a conversation with this and saying, okay, well, what would you do with something like this?
Yeah. So you mentioned confidence, which I think is an important thing to talk about here with AI
Mhm.
because everything that something like ChatGPT does sounds very confident and competent, even if it
Mhm.
is incompetent. So, for example, last week I asked it to write a new, like professional bio for me,
Mhm.
and it was about 50% right, and it was 50% totally fabricated. Like I went to Harvard Law or I went to Harvard Business School or something like that, according to it. Um,
Right.
so then for kicks, I thought, oh, I'll ask it about my wife, who is maybe a little less of a online footprint than I do, and it was 100% wrong about her. Her name was
Mhm.
the only thing that was right, which I gave it.
Mhm.
So what do you do if you're a developer, or what's your advice or way of thinking about this? The potential for confident inaccuracy in the answers that you're getting. Generate me some code that does this, and then maybe it's not actually doing it right.
So from a perspective of like, I do a talk on infrastructure as code,
Mm-hmm.
and we stand up and compare Terraform with ARM and Bicep and to some other things like Pulumi and Ansible and maybe some other tools that can go out and generate that for you.
Mm-hmm.
And in the process of putting together the examples where I was trying to, spin up the same thing in each of these, it took me quite a bit of time to get the code right, get it all to work. With ChatGPT, I said generate, and I described what I wanted in Terraform, and boom, it laid out an entire Terraform script. I went out and said, okay, Terraform apply, and it came back with some errors because, well, the Terraform was trained 2 years ago, and I'm running a new version of Terraform, and some of the
Mm-hmm.
providers have changed. So it's just a matter of just tweaking it a little bit. But
Mm-hmm.
90% of it was pretty good. ARM Bicep, was a little bit better, but still it wasn't 100%. And what I think you have to do with the models, I mean, there's two parts to your comment. One is that ChatGPT wants to give you a human-like answer. That sounds good.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds like it was, I ask it about my grandfather, and it comes back with, that he was a physicist in Chicago working on something, and I'm like, not really, but that's great. On the other hand, it is able to take things that it does have examples of, and specifically around code, it's looking at code libraries on different things that are public libraries of code, and saying, okay, well, here's something that does something like this. And so, um, yeah, if you take something from ChatGPT and click on run, you're going to get exactly what you asked for. You put zero into it, and it may be mostly correct, but that little thing could also be the big problem that you have to fix
Mm-hmm.
later on.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you still need to know why you're doing it and what you're trying to accomplish so that you can evaluate. Is it, how's the response and does it help me get further along that path? I think, one of the things that a lot of developers struggle with, uh, some developers, not everyone. There's people who are, applying the best practices a lot more than I do, like test-driven development. Test-driven development, everyone that I know talks about how great it is. How many practice it?
Yeah.
So I'm going to write
Fewer.
unit tests for everything. Well, yeah, of course I do. If I test it, I put it into production, and if anyone calls, then I know that I've got to fix it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oops. Should
Exactly.
be writing unit tests, but stepping back and taking a code base and saying, let's add unit tests to this. Okay, well, that's an investment of time. And if you
Mm-hmm.
can have a tool that makes that process easier, okay, well, now you have less excuse for not doing it.
Yeah, that's a great point. So for the developers that might be still a little, fearful of this, even after everything we've said, I've seen some
Mhm.
tools out there that I think they'll be more excited about, like one that generates comments for you or generates documentation
Mhm.
by reading your code. What types of like annoying tasks or menial labor or things that developers don't even really want to do have you seen that AI can do that could get somebody listening to this excited?
I think the documentation and trying to create documentation from where you take a web API and you just say generate the documentation for it, which is what Swagger tries to do and publishes that so that consumers of your endpoint get to see the basic
Hmm.
stuff. But that's not really depending on the developer injecting that much work into it. Where I think we'll see this really shine is when it is really complex things where you do want to have some of these best practices. Create a container that's running in Alpine version of Ubuntu with this version that is doing these kinds of things. I think the place where ChatGPT and these AI things are going to really shine is coming to speed and leveling up our knowledge and being able to apply things like containerization, the microservices mindset, understanding domain-driven design, being able to step back and say, okay, well, looking at this, what are the main domains, and having it
Hmm.
apply, a particular model to it. One of the things that it seems like it's really good at is taking an existing, something and summarizing or
Hmm.
or explaining or describing.
Um, yeah, I use it for that all the time. If there's a long document,
Hmm.
uh, you can just give it to it. Of course, Chat GPT 3, which is what most of us are using right now, doesn't have a very
Hmm.
long number of, what do they call
Input.
it, tokens.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think 4 is supposed to have fixed that. So that's going to get
Hmm.
even more useful.
Well, I think the application of that model and then how are you consuming it? If you're consuming it straight from the website, there's limitations. Azure has some services for OpenAI, and I can go out and I
Hmm.
can provision a service and deploy a model, and then use that model, in my own custom way with my own limitations for what I want to do. Am I doing summarization? Am I doing understanding? Am I how do I want to process that? And I think that it's very early with how we're going to see this, you know, come across. Bill Gates kind of described this as one of the two main things he's seen in his lifetime is the AI where we are today is one of those points, just kind of
Hmm.
like the personal computer was.
Hmm. Wow. Yeah. I think if you use something like ChatGPT for just a couple minutes, it can be pretty impressive, right? I mean, what it does
Hmm.
is really impressive. If you use it a lot and try and do something productive with it, then you start to see the flaws.
Hmm. Yeah.
um, so, we've been talking a lot about how you could use AI as a developer to kind of augment your tool belt, become a better developer, understand your code better,
Hmm.
right? code more quickly. That's kind of using it as a tool to create code. What about all the tooling that now exists to use AI in your software? So, as
hmm
part of the solution, as developers, we're used to writing the whole algorithm ourselves. But what about these like machine learning models and things like
hmm
that? What do you see going on there that a developer should be thinking about?
So when you're talking about, the tools that are there for the developer to use to do their jobs versus taking the services and the models and the algorithms and kind of this technology and
Hmm.
being able to surface it up in your own product in a way that, someone hasn't thought of before. I
Hmm.
find that to be, kind of the space where, the idea of bots and conversational, that's one path, but what about, like you're writing, whatever kind of a system that you need to be able to identify patterns and be able to, provide
Hmm.
insights and all of that. I think um, it's going to be interesting. Uh, the different clouds have different ways of provisioning and working with that. I know Google and Amazon have invested heavily in this. Microsoft has invested quite a bit into the OpenAI uh, company and is starting to embed that into their products. I mean, whether it's Office, whether it is the Visual Studio, the developer tools, whether it's in Azure, in the provisioning of services and being able to go out and use that. A lot of these things are not entirely new. Cognitive services came out in 2016, 2017 was publicly available, and I could go out and I could use the Vision API to go out and take a look at a picture, and it could scan it and tell you, how many faces there are. It could tell you the age. It could tell you the sentiment. Are they happy? Are
Hmm.
they sad? And it's had all of those kinds of things. But I mean, how much adoption do we see of that? And from the vision, there's a whole lot of things that came up with what's the ethical way that should be used,
Hmm.
which made us step back and say, okay, well, when we're saying we can, doesn't mean that we should.
Right.
It doesn't mean that
Um,
someone else isn't already doing it, but
we're used to kind of coming up with those algorithms all in our heads. Sometimes as a group if it's a complicated one, sometimes as an individual or an architect.
mhm.
Um, how do you think about what types of problems are the most applicable to using like a machine learning algorithm, for example? Do you have a way that you kind of think like, oh, this is a good candidate where I could actually
Mhm.
try this in a machine learning algorithm and see if this works better than whatever some expert could
Mhm.
come up with?
Well, I think of machine learning as being, one of those components of the AI environment, the ecosystem.
Hmm.
Machine learning is I'm feeding it some things I want it to identify on its own, or with some prodding, the different kinds of patterns and things like that. Um, I think of one real good use of just kind of the AI tools in general is going to be for, like my mom is building websites and she's now looking at how she can embed a certain kind of video tag inside of a carousel and using Bootstrap and this and that. And I said, well, why don't you ask ChatGPT for an example?
Hmm.
You know, or take a look at this code and tell me why it's not working. And so I think for someone like her, it's going to be a perfect tool to be able to say, okay, well, let's understand this. So.
Yeah, that's a great tool for that.
Mhm.
So if you had a chance to talk to a developer who's maybe been holding all of this at arm's length, a little nervous about
Mhm.
it or whatever, and they're maybe convinced from our conversation they want to learn more about it now, what places, I know there's a ton of things going on right now in AI, but like where should a
Mhm.
developer go look to kind of get started with this stuff, both on the
Mhm.
you know development side, tooling side, and on the like algorithm incorporating into your own
Mhm.
applications side?
So, how does a developer get started kind of with this
Yeah.
if they haven't
Hmm.
really been digging into it?
Yeah.
I'd start with probably. if you're not using something that has IntelliSense, I mean, first of all, upgrade, go to some tool that's got IntelliSense.
Hmm.
It's going to make your life so much better. But that's something that's kind of a more established use of, you know, essentially AI. It's
Hmm.
artificially figuring out how to help you code.
So that would
Take a
be
look
like
at.
Visual Studio, obviously, where it kind of invented
Mhm,
IntelliSense. VS Code has got that. I
mhm,
know all the JetBrains
yep,
IDEs have that. What other, off the top of your head, where do you start
that
with that?
commoditize it.
Yeah.
When you're writing a SQL query, you can get some help writing, okay, well, finish the SQL query. What are the
Yeah.
names of the tables and all the other stuff?
Hmm.
Because it's scanning the metadata that's there.
Yeah.
But that's kind of a baseline. And if you've been holding off on that, I mean, that's kind of the first thing is just, let the
Hmm.
tools help you,
Hmm.
with what they can do. I think from understanding, GitHub Copilot. I turned it on when I was at an event recently, and it was like, oh, hey, this new thing, GitHub Copilot. And what I found was that it was making suggestions that didn't follow the path that I was going down for my example. And so it kept interrupting and getting in the way of what I was trying to say
Hmm.
and trying to show, because I'm trying to, as a presenter, I'm trying to teach something or, show how something works. So I turned off the GitHub Copilot because it, it can help when you're learning it, but if you're trying to teach it, you need to know what you're doing.
Hmm.
Um, but get a Copilot, if you do turn it on, then it is getting used to how it does kind of make a lot of suggestions.
Hmm.
Um, I think when I'm talking to like my neighbors, we're going for a walk. Hey, have you heard about ChatGPT? And it's like, no, they haven't. It's like, oh, okay. Well, let me explain or describe it to you, and then I send them to the website chat.openai.com. I say, just click on this, create an account, ask a question. It's got some suggestions there.
Hmm.
Start playing around with it.
Hmm.
And once you start playing around with it, and like I was looking at my infrastructure as code, I said, write a session for me or write a demo for me about, deploying an Azure website, using Terraform and show the code. And it generates code for me. I'm like, okay, let me copy the code and see if it works.
Hmm.
Sometimes it does, sometimes it needs a little bit of tweaking, but it gives you a chance to kind of get a feel for the kinds of things it can do. And if you're a Terraform developer, then ask it to do it in Ansible. Ask
Hmm.
it to do it in Bicep. Ask it to do it in CloudFormation. Ask it to do the same thing in a different language you don't know,
Hmm.
but you could recognize whether or not the right things are being done. Writing a button pop up in JavaScript. Well, now do it in TypeScript. Okay, well,
Hmm.
how would I do this in just straight HTML and
Hmm.
CSS or in Bootstrap? And I
Yeah.
think that's probably where you will see the value of it.
I often will have a Chat GPT tab just open on my computer
Hmm.
all day in my browser, and pop in there occasionally to ask it questions. So I think you're right, just playing with it.
Hmm.
You
Yeah,
know,
the
I
new
mentioned,
Edge browser lets you do that really easy. It's
yeah.
almost built in, I think, into the new Edge.
Hmm. Which is cool too, because it gets you. Sometimes the free service on the web can be a
Hmm.
little slow, or even you can get locked out of it because there's too many people using it. But that
Hmm.
Microsoft's paying the big bucks to get you in if you're using Edge, right? So,
Yeah.
and if
Well,
you're afraid of using Edge, it actually uses Chromium to do the rendering, so it's going to be the
right.
same experience you'd have in Chrome, except maybe better memory usage.
Hmm. Something like that.
Yeah,
Something like that. I mean, there's things that they're doing to try to promote their version of reality.
yeah.
Whether it's Chrome, whether it's Edge, whether it's whatever the tool is. Um, but stepping back and just saying, okay, well, maybe I should be paying attention to this, and
Hmm.
how could I use it? I think there's a lot of blogs and a lot of articles out there that talk about how to create the perfect prompt for different things. Doesn't hurt to be perusing those things, but by playing with it, and if you're there's an event going on and someone's talking about it, just take a look at it. I
Yeah,
think live events are one of my favorite ways of learning things. Um, so in the interest of that, I'm putting together a session. It's all about how to use ChatGPT
that's
using
right.
.NET
Come
Core.
come
Right.
to events this year and see you speak about this,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Those are all
exactly.
great places to get started, great ways to get started.
Hmm.
Last question. Always like to ask
Hmm.
this. We have a lot of really smart guests like yourself on here,
Hmm.
and I always like to know what you all think we should be talking about, who we should be talking to, what other topics
Hmm.
or guests should we be thinking about here, on
Hmm.
our theme of making software more reliably successful.
Hmm. Well, and to answer that, I think, when it comes to what we should be, what kinds of topics are going to be important, I think more AI, more
Mm,
understanding how the tools integrate, and diving into, how do I go out and use this stuff. For like a guest, someone that I think that I would love to see is Jennifer Marsman.
mm,
I worked with her back when I was at Microsoft a long time ago, and she's been part of the Microsoft team that's been doing some great stuff with machine learning for a long time. And
mhm.
I think, she's her activism, or not activism, but her action and advocacy for STEM and for women in technology. I think she's got some great things that I would love to hear where she's at and what she's doing and
Yeah.
what she views the future of the stuff is going to be.
That sounds great. I think this topic is worth more than one guest on for sure.
Hmm.
And I know Jennifer, and she's amazing, and definitely
Hmm.
would be an excellent guest. So great suggestion. Thank you.
Hmm.
If people want to find you online, I know you're Imagine Technologies for your
Hmm.
consulting business.
Yep.
And you do something really interesting, which is on your website, which is Benko Tips, Benko tips, tips.com. You do something
Yep.
really interesting there where you have a free call-in appointments on Fridays for questions
Yep.
about, is it Azure or cloud?
So it's called Azure Office Hours,
Mm-hmm.
and I used to do this back when I was at Microsoft, and I left, and I'm like, I like hearing what people are doing,
Mm-hmm.
and I've got LinkedIn Learning courses, I've got sessions and topics that I talk at different conferences. But if you have a question, if you want to reach out and just kind of, hey, I'm trying this, I'm running into this problem, you know anyone that can help us with this or that. Azure Office Hours are 15 minutes. It's every Friday. There's a link that'll create a Zoom call for us. Feel free to click the link on benkotips.com. Azure Office Hours, and 15 minutes, talk about anything you want, cloud, Azure, technology, you know, Microsoft. Hey, why does .NET 8 have this thing going on? Well, I might not know the answer, but I could connect you with someone who does.
Mm-hmm.
And so you use that to kind of, stay in touch.
Yeah, that's a great offering. I like that.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a really interesting conversation, and we could probably keep talking about it forever because there's so
Hmm.
much to talk about here. But I appreciate your time delving into it a little bit today, Mike. Thanks for your
Absolutely.
expertise and your time. And hopefully, we'll get Jennifer on here at some point, and we can have you back as well.
That'd be great.
All right. Bye bye. That's the end of this Blue Blazes podcast. If you're interested in hearing more conversations like this one with industry experts focused on how to make software projects more predictably successful, make sure to subscribe. Trailhead can be found online at trailheadtechnology.com, on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Until next time, thanks for listening.